the failure to teach the controversy, to me, is the real failure. But the problem is, if a high school teacher teaches this and the students go home, the parents complain to the school board.
Robert, you just hit the nail on the head. I mean, I talked a few moments ago about the story that kind of opened into the little historic discovery that I had, which is that you can track the Texas Revolution back to the story of Stephen F. Austin being put into prison, and from there it blossoms forward into getting more and more upset until Texas colonists just decide that they're going to stand up totally against the government and the military in Texas, and then you have that clash and that conflict, which leads to the win and the coming of the Texas Republic. Now take that story and balance it against what is the story of amazing loss to Mexicans. Now I love to be a patriot for U.S. stories and especially our military and so forth and so on. And a lot of times we try to tell all of our stories in the best possible way so that it works out that we've been victorious in most of the engagements that we've been in. But one of them that is getting a lot of scrutiny now in the last decade or two has been the war with Mexico, the American war with Mexico, because immediately upon Texas coming into the Union, the American Union, the American forces under Polk turned around and began to, under his direction, to attack Mexico, in essence, to be able to take the territory that was Mexican territory away from them, between roughly the longitude of where Texas is all the way over to the West Coast, to where California is. So there was a giant predication that was done in order for the U.S. to say, okay, we're going to go to war with you over this territory, Mexico. And they eventually did. They eventually cornered, Mexico and won that war, that war between the war of 1846 to 1848, the U.S. war with Mexico, and won that territory by concession, on the grounds of Mexico. Well, now what happens in the Mexican education system? They need to go explain their loss of this territory. So they don't take and chunk out the story about their interaction with Texas and the United States in the same way that we do. What do? They talk about the war with United States, where they lost all of this territory. It was 50% of their territory they lost to the United States. How do they predicate that? They say, well, that happened after the loss of Texas to the United States, or to itself, as a republic, and then they work it backwards until the first event in the loss of all this territory to the United States is what? The imprisonment of Stephen F. Austin in a Mexican Inquisition prison. So you have that story being the first story of a victory on the Texas side in creating a republic, and you have it the first step in the story of tragic loss on the Mexican side. So how do you take and unify those stories? What kind of education system do we have, and how do we teach? We tend to teach in bullet points because that's the best way that we can learn. We don't talk about those shades of gray, like you said, but it's in those shades of gray, in teaching those things that get us that story of how we won or how we lost, depending upon which side of that Texas-Mexican line you're on. So that's what contributes to this cultural gap that we have, in talking about loss on one side of the border and gain on the other side of the border that's related to the border itself. So we have to get different bullet points, because it's a difficult thing for us to take and impress upon our young people, or whether it's in school or in university or at any level, even on us old people. It's how do we do that? If it's down to bullet points, then we need to change our bullet points.
The complexity, and again, as a Louisiana person, I have a tendency when I go somewhere, like when I went to Turkey, it was, what kind of food you got? I'm from Louisiana. That's just how I am. And I'm like, what kind of music you got? And then I'm like comparing and contrasting and looking at things through music, and then through food, and then through food items, and then like colonization and like old world and new world crops, converging. So like pumpkins and squash are from the new world. It's like looking at all of this. Just in Louisiana food, gumbo, okra is an ingredient that came from Africa with African slaves and then is commonly eaten in Louisiana. Much maligned, by the way. I like okra. It's just those little things that for me, I have a great historical sense. I think this stuff is painfully interesting, but the more layers I peel back, you see this sort of complexity. And I think, again, that whitewashing of history, trying to make it simple, especially when we're talking about, in your case, we're talking about these clash of empires between England, France, and Spain. Like when I would think about being in school and it's like, oh, the Louisiana Purchase, well, they just bought it. And I'm like, people live there, bro. Like every Native American tribe up to the Canada was like part of that land, and you just sold it out from underneath